Hey guys, what's up? So, today, this video is still supply and demand, but we're going to change things a little bit. Instead of just saying, hey, what's the quantity and price in the market? One of the big messages last time, right? And instead of explaining why shortages and surpluses lead to equilibrium and what happens when the market changes, those are also situations where we leave the market to do its own thing. Today, we're going to talk about what happens if we intervene in the market. So, what do I mean by that? I mean, sometimes we don't let the quantity and price just adjust by some invisible hand. Sometimes we intervene. For instance, sometimes we say that prices need to be higher. One example of this is minimum wage. There's a market, a labor market, where the government says, hey, now you have to pay at least a certain amount for that labor. Okay, makes sense. That's something we see. There's also something where we can set a maximum price on things. Now, that might be, some people argue for maximum price on pharmaceuticals, drugs, so people can get their medicine. Some people in larger cities will argue for rent control, where there's a maximum rental price. Stuff like that. That's relevant to our discussion. And sometimes there's even limitations on quantities, where a market's only allowed to have a certain number of transactions. And so I want to dig into all that today. Now, I've got lots of technical videos. Okay, so you can check out the videos after this for like the specific graphy stuff. But I want to give you some sort of idea of what we're looking for. And before I do, I want to introduce the concepts of consumer and producer surplus. Okay, economics, it's a social science. We try to predict what people do. And with consumer and producer surplus, we also try to measure the well-being of those people. Now, it's going to look like just weird triangles on a graph for you, but I want you to think about it. To some extent, I want you to think deeper about it. Let's talk about consumer surplus. When you work along a demand curve, at any given quantity, there's a price showing on your demand curve. And if the price of a good is less than the price on the demand curve, that means you're paying less than what you were willing to pay. You would have paid this higher number to get that quantity, but because the price is lower, you don't have to. And every one of you, I'm pretty sure, likes getting a good deal and likes paying less for things than you're willing to pay. We all like having dollars left in our pockets to spend on other things and whatever. I'm not going to pretend money buys happiness, but I am going to say that for as simple a market as we're dealing with, this is really our only good measure of consumer well-being. So, what is consumer surplus? It's the gap between what we're willing to pay and the price we actually pay for every transaction. There'll be lots of examples for you to work on in the book and stuff, like you'll get it, but it's the extra willingness to pay. We would have been willing to spend consumer surplus more dollars than we actually spent for the same number of goods. But since we didn't have to, those are dollars left in our pocket, which we like. Okay, fair. I hope that helps. Check out the technical videos too, or put questions in the discussion forums. Not enough of you are doing that. Or set up office hours, or visit the TA's office hours in person, because he's awesome. Seriously, that kid's smart. Just saying. All right. So that was consumer surplus. Producer surplus, something similar. It's the gap between the price and a seller's willingness to sell. Now, we're going to learn later that the willingness to sell is based on something called marginal cost. It's the cost of producing the next unit. If me selling one more pizza costs me $5 to make it, but I get to sell it for $13, that's $8 of bonus, $8 of producer surplus. Now, producer surplus might sound a lot like profit when I say it's the gap between price and marginal cost. Very similar. The only difference between producer surplus and profit is that producer surplus ignores fixed costs. We'll learn more about that later. But if you want to, you can think of producer surplus as being almost the same as profit. Same idea. More of it makes a firm happy. Now, okay, that's the background on that stuff. The consumer producer surplus, something interesting about it is it is maximized, or I should say total surplus, consumer plus producer, is maximized when the market's in equilibrium. Okay, it's the gap. So consumer surplus between demand curve and price, but only for the units sold. Producer surplus between price and supply curve, but only for units sold. The way you get the biggest area shaded on the graphs is by letting it go to equilibrium. Check out the videos and I'll show you what I mean. Now, what happens then when we meddle with the market? When we push the price up higher with a price floor, or we push the price down lower with a price ceiling? Or what happens when we just mess with the quantity and say it can't go above a certain point? Well, let's think about it. Price floors. We say there's a minimum price. It has to be above equilibrium for it to matter, right? A few years ago, minimum wage actually mattered. Right now in Texas, it doesn't. Minimum wage is $7.25, but McDonald's is still paying people like $15 to flip burgers. Okay, that's an example of a price floor. That's not doing anything because it's below the market price. The market price is better than the price floor anyway. But if we had set the minimum wage higher than the market price, that would disrupt the market because it would mean that lots of people wanted to work for the higher wage and not as many companies wanted to hire them because it's more expensive. Maybe they'd cut hours, maybe they'd get some more equipment to substitute for labor. I don't know, whatever it may be. That high price means that's a lot like a surplus, right? Surplus of labor, we've mentioned that. I think I did. Might have been intermediate. Oh well. Now, when there's a surplus, how many transactions happen? Is it the higher quantity supplied? Do all the workers get jobs that they want? Or is it the lower quantity demanded? It's the lower one. You need a buyer and a seller for a transaction to happen, which means if quantity supplied is higher than the quantity demanded, you will have the quantity demanded as your number of market transactions, because that's the only amount that people actually want to buy. So the book's going to dig into a lot of inefficiencies that come from price floors. Okay, there's a lot to put. I'm not going to like go through the specific list. I want you to read. It's good for you. But to give you some ideas that you might be able to connect to your list, if minimum wage is too high, then it is harder for a company to find a good pizza, a good burger flipper, because they get tons of applications for a limited number of jobs. There's a big lineup. The workers you get, you might get some really good workers, but honestly, the added benefit of them being extra good workers might not be enough. And you wish you could just be in a situation where you could pay a mediocre worker a little less because the added benefit doesn't match the added costs. There's redistribution. Okay, when you jack up the price, that's going to help some sellers, workers. It's going to harm buyers, in this case, businesses. And then when the quantity falls, there are some people who would have had a job in equilibrium who won't have one at all. right? So there's going to be a lot of side effects from this price floor. And the market won't be efficient. It won't maximize total surplus. So there's a cost, which is this big inefficiency, this big loss of dollars gained in a market, but it helps some sellers. And those sellers somehow managed to convince the government to put this law in place, and there you go. All right. I'll go a little faster through price ceilings. Price ceilings are when you push the price down. So the book talks about rent control as an example of a price ceiling. Rent's too high, so we push it down. When you push the rent down, that means people start moving out of their parents. People want to move out of their parents' basements. That means people who had roommates want to get their own house. It means people want to buy more real estate or rent more real estate. Quantity demanded rises. But fewer people want to rent it out because it's not useful or it's not as beneficial or profitable. They'd rather hang on to it for themselves or something. And so that creates a gap where we're out of equilibrium again with a shortage. People want more than what's out there to sell. How many people actually get the apartments? And it's equal to the number of apartments that there are up for sale. Okay, it's always the lesser of the two quantities. When there's a surplus, it was the quantity supplied. No, wait, quantity demanded. When there's a shortage, it's the quantity supplied. The lower of the two quantities is always one that says how many transactions happen. Now the price ceiling. Buyer benefits from the low price. Seller doesn't. You can tell by how much the consumer and producer surplus have changed. But there will also be people who lose entirely because there are just fewer transactions. By the way, you'll get to the graphs. When we talk about there being fewer transactions, those are transactions where surplus would have been generated, but now it's just not. And so it's lost. There's no surplus there. That inefficiency, that hole in the graph, we call deadweight loss. It's lost benefits to society because we're not at the efficient point anymore. We're not at the equilibrium. Now, last one, and this one I'll dig into a little more. You might notice this picture behind me of a taxi cab and a phone. New York City has a lot of taxis, and they actually regulate how many taxis are allowed to be on the street at any given time. They have these taxi medallions, which is a license for a cab. And you have to have one of these in your car or else you can't legally drive a taxi. And New York City only issues a certain number of these every year. They keep the quantity low for two reasons at least. One, reduces congestion, which makes sense. And two, the taxi companies who own a ton of them like it because it means there's less taxis on the road. And as you've learned, low supply leads to high prices. So if you have a taxi, you want fewer taxis around you, right? Yeah, that's a thing. We might call it rent seeking if you try to get the government to move a market in your favor. It's a big thing with all of these. Anyway, back to these taxis. They charge a lot of money. And they charge by the minute and by the mile and all kinds of other stuff. And I want to share a picture with you. If we were in a live class, I would ask you to guess how much people would pay for a taxi medallion. And I usually get students who guess $10,000, $50,000, $20. Okay. I once had a student guess as high as $100,000. What's your guess? How much would someone pay to drive a taxi, to be able to drive a taxi? That's not including your mileage and vehicle registration and everything else. That's just to have this little medallion showing up saying you're allowed to pick people up. Let me find a bigger graph for us. At one point in 2014, companies were paying more than $1 million for a single taxi medallion. More than $1 million for a single car to be driving around. Now, you'll notice that that's not what they're paying anymore. I know this isn't zoomed in, or this isn't that it's zoomed out pretty far, but you can Google it yourself if you want to. But from this 1.1 or 2 million up here, it has since plummeted to just a couple $100,000. A lot of people call that the Uber effect. That was 2014. Uber became a big thing in New York because all these taxis were so stupid expensive. They were so expensive that it was worth paying $1 million to get one in your company. Right? So all the consumers paying these absurdly high prices. Oh, by the way, let me come back around to it. Quota was lower quantity, pushes prices high. That's extra money for the sellers. Producer surplus will be really high. The graph looks a lot like with a price floor, but it's from the quantity angle instead of the price angle. Anyway, when Uber shows up, it's a lower priced substitute. What happens when the price of a substitute falls? Going from no substitute to a low priced one, that's kind of like falling. The demand for taxis falls. And so people start going on taxis a lot less. They're all getting Ubers. Taxi cabs aren't bringing in the revenue they used to, and so no one wants to buy medallions. Well, people still do. They pay a couple $100,000 for them, but it's only a fraction of what it used to be. All right, this has been a long ramble. Couple of big takeaways. We learned about producer and consumer surplus to measure well-being. Total well-being is maximized in equilibrium, but in this chapter I introduced 3 different ways that the government can push us away from that maximized point. There can be lots of reasons. I'm not going to get into it. It could be someone's convinced the government on some moral issue that we should help the consumers or the producers at the expense of the producers or the consumers. It could be that there was some sort of lobbying or some sort of other influence being pushed on the government to just help existing businesses. I mean, who knows? It can be all kinds of things. But we do have lots of times where laws are in place that make markets inefficient and create deadweight loss. Now, that's for markets that work well. In another class, another time, we will talk about markets that aren't working well, where some of these policies can actually be good ideas that make things more efficient. But that's beyond what we're going to do in this class. Spoilers, healthcare, lots of environmental stuff, education, some of those like big hot topic political things. A lot of those are the ones that are inefficient to begin with, which means that government intervention potentially, if you choose the right kind, can make it better. But yeah, that really depends on the policy. Anyway, guys, I hope that's helpful. This is just the overview. Don't forget, the technical videos will take you through all the graphs and do all the fun stuff. Good luck, guys. Have fun.